methods of collecting data. That was the coral reefs one. Coral reefs, there was observations, there was experiments, and then we talked about things that were double blind, bias, small sample. All right, so here we go. Guidelines for designing a statistical study. Bottom of 14. All right, bottom of 14. Okay, so ways that we collect data for a study. So if we are going to design a statistical study, the first thing we want to do is identify our variable of interest. And that's the focus, and we have to make sure that we can narrow it down. So it's one variable that we're looking at. And then, how'd you do? No? Okay. The population that we're going to be studying. Okay, so we're on the bottom of page 14 in the packet. Okay. All right, so now it says develop a detailed plan for collecting data. If you use a sample, we want to make sure our sample is representative of the population, right? So representative of the population. So often that convenience sample will not work, but some sort of stratified sample, simple random sampling. If we have to use a volunteer situation. We try to make sure that we're asking enough people so we have enough response that's a good enough data set. All right, the third thing is obviously collecting that data. And that's kind of the end of this unit, is like we've collected the data. We did with our pumpkin thing, we then started to analyze that data. So we described the data using descriptive statistic techniques. So let's think about what those were that we just did. We found averages, right? An average is a descriptive statistic. We also did a candlestick plot, or it was a very modified box plot to kind of see a visual of the spread. So that was just us describing the data by doing that, okay? We did then start to think about why the data was looking as it was, why one sample was different than the other three, and that is doing interpretation. So then we're going to interpret the data to make decisions about the population using inferential statistics. So remember, that's the idea of making predictions and helps us make decisions. And we did figure out what the yield was, but we also figured out that the river had an influence. And then we had to maybe just identify any possible errors, our errors in our statistical study. All right. So if we were out there as biologists, as doctors, as statisticians, as anyone who is collecting data, sports statisticians, we would be, and we're looking at not necessarily just collecting data for historical purposes, we're looking at a variable that we want to figure out more about. This is what you would need to do. Okay? All right, so let's go ahead and turn the page. This is kind of a repeat, but it goes in a little more detail. We saw the coral reef experiment in the video, and that was an observational study. So the researcher observes and measures characteristics of interest in part of a population, but does not change the existing condition. So they're literally just making observations. So that was the coral reef. My older sister actually had the opportunity this summer to go out to Wyoming and hike up in the mountains, and they were taking water samples from like the areas where the snow melt is to analyze that water, and then they would bring it back down, those samples, they bring it back down the mountain. They had two alpacas with them to kind of carry all their equipment. They were up there for about a week. So it was kind of cool that her friend is a professor out there. And so she got to go participate in that as just part of the team. Okay, so that's another thing. They're just collecting stuff, but they're not changing the water that's there, right? Okay. Performing an experiment, of course, this is kind of what we always think about. And of course, that was with the medications. We saw that. If I want to check to see if those medications affect arthritis or all sorts of different things. It's a treatment that's applied to a population, and then the responses that are observed from that. And that could be anything from interviewing people, but also taking, like if it's medication, they might do a blood sample. If they're doing an exercise program, you might be weighing people and measuring people to see what kind of changes there are. Another population may be used as the control group. So having that control group is a big idea. There's also the idea of a placebo that you might be given, so we can really make sure that the result is happening because of the medication itself. And so the appearance of taking a medication is important. Hello and welcome. We're finishing page 15, or on page 15 of our notes. And I collected that. Okay. Yeah. And then you're comparing those results and then analyzing it and then hopefully getting some information. Remember, it was kind of interesting. In the one in the video with the arthritis, the result was neither the supplement nor the medication did anything really different than the placebo, right? And although that's extremely disappointing, it is an important result, right? There was the gentleman from the Veterans Affairs, and so you don't want your veterans who might be on limited income paying for medications or supplements that aren't going to help them. Okay, so knowing that something doesn't work is just as powerful as knowing that something does work. And of course, cancer treatments are something that people are constantly trying to find the thing that works. Okay, so people are willing to partake in those medication trials. All right, some more things. Of course, things always have pros and cons. So we have our observational studies. The pros occurs in nature, not in a lab. They can be used when it's unethical or dangerous to conduct an experiment. Okay, so that's kind of an interesting pro. I'm just observing people or children, right? You don't want to necessarily do anything to a child because that could affect them adversely. They can also be used when researchers cannot manipulate the variables. Okay, it's not something that you can do, you can only observe. I'm not going to go up into the sky and try to affect a cloud so the snowpack at the top of the mountain is different. All right. There are cons, though, because remember, observations, you cannot necessarily do the cause and effect piece, okay? That cannot always be determined because there's other factors out there that we can't eliminate. So the nice thing about an experiment is that you can really hone in and get rid of those confounding variables that might affect what's going on. Observational studies can be expensive and time consuming. A lot of them are done year after year. So these long studies where you work with a population, something's going on, you're checking in on them. They come back in 6 months, you're checking on them again. So over the past, during this year from January through the year, there's been a lot of changes at the National Institutes of Health and the CDC, and they have taken away funding from these long-term time-consuming projects, which that means those results are in the toilet. And that's why there was a lot of people outraged by those changes and the loss of funding that would happen through the DOGE committee. Let's see. We also they can have unreliable data because you're relying on recordings from the past. So we'll see an example of that where people go into the past and they look at data and they're making observations about things and that they are maybe drawing a conclusion from that. But once again, there could be some flaws to that. So pros and cons for observation, then we have pros and cons for an experiment. So the experiment, of course, your researcher has the control, right? All that control about manipulating the groups, manipulating the variables, and honing in on that. So that's definitely a pro, and that's why we have medication studies. They might occur in unnatural settings as a lab or a special classroom. Maybe with the one-way mirror, right? We're observing what's going on in the other room when different stimuli is happening. This can lead to what's called the Hawthorne effect. So I'm going to show you that video in one moment. They can also have those confounding variables like, oh, you get a chair, but you don't. Okay, and that was kind of an Arceli experiment, but it is a confounding variable. All right, so in an experiment, you could have this thing that's called the Hawthorne effect. So let's go to that video. It's about 3 minutes long, and it will make total sense to you once they explain it. So I'm going to start that, but make sure my volume is decent before I do. Here we go.
The Hawthorne effect is the tendency we have to perform better when we know somebody is studying us. For example, a 2015 study of hospital staff hand-washing found that staff were almost 3 times more likely to wash their hands when they knew they were being studied. The term Hawthorne effect comes from an experiment conducted at a US factory run by General Electric in Hawthorne near Chicago during the 1920s into factors that affected productivity. Everything worked. Increasing the illumination of the factory boosted productivity. Dimming the lights boosted productivity. Introducing rest pauses also worked. So did small group incentives. Oddly, after a positive change, returning to previous work conditions was also met with positive results. One popular interpretation of these results is that the novelty of being observed leads humans to perform tasks better. When we feel we're being studied, we improve our behaviour. While the experiment has been described as a glorified anecdote, and it certainly falls well short of modern social science, it gives rise to this famous Hawthorne effect. Modern studies have confirmed.
So I just cut it off there because maybe the rest of it wasn't relevant. So for example, if you decide to partake in a study about exercise, you might be more willing to not only exercise, but also fix your diet or do something different to do that. Now, you guys have experienced this as well. A couple times a year, my boss comes into the room to observe me. So I not only do I perk up and try to be like the best teacher ever, but doesn't everybody in the room also perk up a little bit? We're the best students ever. Listen. It happens. We don't, when we're on display, we want to be our best selves. So there's nothing wrong with it. It's just that you have to understand that it's an influence. Okay, and the best thing that I liked about this description was we put the lights on, they're doing great. We turn the lights off, they're doing great. It's because they knew they were being watched and being monitored for their production. It didn't matter what it was. They just knew they wanted to do well. Okay, so that's the Hawthorne effect. Whee, hello. That was very loud again. Okay, here we go. So now let's go ahead and put that down, and we will go back to the notes. Hawthorne effect. I think we can turn the page. Beep, beep. And so experiments, some things that can ruin experiments. So once again, the idea of not necessarily a kind of an experiment, but you've done the experiment and you can't use your results because of the following things have occurred. So when we have an experiment, we might have those confounding variables. And so that occurs when an experiment cannot tell the difference between the effects of different factors on the variable. So for example, there could be a restaurant, A-U-R-A-N-T, a restaurant that does a remodel. They close down and they remodel, and they have put a whole bunch of excitement into reopening. You all right? Oh dear. This is Ms. Rupp. Yeah. He is. For sure. Yep. Mr. Payne, you've been asked to go to 243 Oak Unit Office. Okay, I'm going to approve that pass. Do you need another pen for now? Sure, awesome. Another pen would be fabulous. Here's a pen, and we can look for the spring in a minute.
Thank you.
Yeah. Those tricky little suckers flying out of there.
What?
All right.
More responsible next time.
Let me refresh. Maybe the things will go off. Ding ding. Today's appointments. Well, this guy's still up making a pass. Forget it. He's on his way. Okay, so let me go back to the restaurant remodel. There it is. Ding ding. I love these things. Approved. So they closed down the restaurant. They've done a remodel. They're getting ready to reopen. The reopening does not go as well. And they're looking at their numbers and they're like, what's going on? I thought everything was going to be good. So what happens if there happened to be maybe road construction that blocked the way that people normally get there, right? Maybe there was some sort of a festival that drew people away. Maybe there had been a crime committed somewhere in that neighborhood and so people were staying away. So it's not the beautification of the restaurant or the implementing new cooking equipment that affected the numbers. It was other things that affected the numbers. Okay, so it's kind of an example that's a little bit easier to understand. The other thing is that we have, and like if you want to go back to Grey's Anatomy, the confounding variable when Meredith Grey decided to give somebody the actual medicine, not the placebo, right? She played God and kind of undid the blindness of the experiment. Like that's clearly a confounding variable. Her emotions got in the way, and therefore the whole experiment had to be dumped. Okay, so the idea of a double blind is very important to the legitimacy of a study that's being done. The placebo effect is that idea when a subject reacts favorably to a placebo when in fact the subject has been given no medical treatment at all. And so once again, sometimes that happens with people in migraine studies. Like, I'm taking the placebo, my migraine goes away, but really it shouldn't have gone away, but it was just mind over matter. Now, real migraines might not, there's definitely things that doesn't work for. Another one, so like a placebo patient reports improvement. Now, if there's one patient that reports improvement on the placebo, I don't think that's going to ruin a whole entire experiment. But once again, it's that idea of you really got to be careful about your conclusions when you put them out as fact. Okay? All right, so then there are other methods, and this is not a complete list, but we talked about we're using surveys to collect data. You guys have been parts of surveys before. In fact, there is a survey in your classroom right now from the Greece Marketplace. So the Greece Marketplace has put a survey in the Google Classroom. They want to know if people would buy these snacks and how much they're willing to pay for those snacks if they were available during advisement or somewhere. The Greece Marketplace is also, they called it Athena Marketplace last year. They did like the tumblers and the t-shirts and some other stuff for school. Okay, so there's that idea of doing a survey. We are going to be working on the carefully worded survey so you get the right answer, or the answer you want, and your answers are not biased. So that is something to be aware of, that if you have a poorly worded question, you might not get the results you're looking for. And then the last one is using simulations. Now, simulations are really helpful. They can be mathematical models or they can be physical models to reproduce conditions of a situation or a process. And you do that because it's expensive to have the real situation. It is not healthy to have the real situation, those kinds of things. So for example, I want to do like test to see how the car does when it has an impact, right? So certainly there are, car companies that do what's called crash test dummy simulations. They don't put real people in those cars and then have them drive 60 miles per hour into a pylon, right? They do that with a crash test dummy that has all sorts of sensors on it so they can see what the impact is. There's also all sorts of weather modeling that can be done to help predict if tornadoes or hurricanes, where those things, how they behave and where they might land, right? So that's kind of a predictive model in a simulation. The last one, of course, and this is also really important for people in our the armed services, for people that are going to be pilots, and even people that are going to be doctors, things that have ramifications. There are all sorts of like a test pilot simulation, right? Where you can go and sit in a cockpit that's just like the real cockpit, but you're not flying the plane, are you? Right? You're doing a simulation to see how you would react in certain situations. So the idea of someone that is training to be a pilot. Now, when we teach, I don't know if they have them. I probably do somewhere. But you know, when you guys are learning how to drive, we just take you out on the road, don't we, or put you in a parking lot? That's something that we've agreed as a society that yes, it's risky if we don't take you on the highway first, right? We build up little steps, or we take you somewhere where you can start to practice things. Something that I think is really important because of where we live. The first time it snows, you need to go find a parking lot that hasn't been plowed yet and go whip around in the snow and learn how to like steer into a curve, like a spin out kind of a thing. Those defensive driving skills are really important when you live in weather conditions like ours. So there aren't a lot of simulators that I'm aware of that do that for us. And of course, I really like Mario Kart, right? But is Mario Kart the simulator for our cars? No. But it does work for the indoor go-karts, by the way. My kid was really good at drifting over the summer. He had a good time. Not entertaining. Really trying hard, kids. Okay, so let me just quickly summarize before I close out. This lesson, because we did a whole bunch of stuff and it was broken into two different things. Methods of collecting data, right? We want to study something. There's a bunch of different methods to do it. Basically, there's observing, there's doing experiments, which require lots of design. There is doing a survey, which requires good questioning. There's simulations that allow us to practice things without spending as much money or hurting people and maybe even objects. There's an exhaustive list of a couple more things that you've definitely heard of, but those go through the basic four, okay? Ways we can collect data.